Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Living in Switzerland. The series is brought to you by Rigby. We are a staffing and project services company based in Zurich. If you or anyone you know of is looking for a new role in Switzerland, or if you're looking to hire, let us know. We'd be happy to help. The best way to do that is by going to rigby.ch/apply and filling out the form. Then, if we have anything that might be of interest, we'll gladly let you know.
Hello and welcome. This is Daniel from Rigby.
And I'm Diccon. I live in Bern and I write books about Switzerland.
We are two Brits who both moved to Switzerland at around the same time in 2005. In this series, we'll be talking about what we've learned since then and some of our experiences of living here.
Over the years, when speaking to people who are new to Switzerland, we've noticed that there are several questions which very often come up. In this episode, we'll be answering 7 of these frequently asked questions.
Yeah, these are questions I get asked very frequently when I do events or by emails, so we thought we'd tackle them head on.
All right then, let's get started. So we don't pull any punches here. We're going to start right away with something quite contentious, which is opening hours. Why are they so restricted?
This is the thing that really drives expats or visitors mad, because most people are used to 24-hour shopping and things like that, and Switzerland is still in around 1980, and it's generally there to preserve the work-life balance, not only for shop workers, but for everyone. And I actually hated it to begin with, and now I really appreciate it, because Sunday things are shut and changes have to be approved by a referendum. In Bern last month, they voted not to change. And so what this translates into is basically shops are shut on Sundays and holidays. Holidays count as Sundays. There is no 24-hour shopping. And there are local differences. So if you live in Zurich, you have the excitement of shops being open till 8 o'clock Monday through Saturday, whereas in Bern, for instance, they close at 7.
Right, and this actually went to the vote in Bern as recently as last month.
Yes, they had the extraordinary proposal. We're allowed to open 2 Sundays a month in December for Christmas shopping. And they had this revolutionary idea to open 4 Sundays a month for Christmas shopping. And it was rejected by an overwhelming majority. It wasn't even opening every Sunday, it was opening an extra 2, and it didn't pass.
And does anything open on a Sunday?
Yes, luckily you can shop on a Sunday, mainly in train stations. So large train stations like Geneva or Bern or Zurich have shopping centres, like proper shopping centres. But also in the main airports and at petrol stations, you'll find convenience stores. And of course, tourist shops in places like Interlaken are open, so you can get that souvenir you're desperate for.
And Dickon, just putting your travel writer hat on for a second, if someone wanted to explore the country by train, are there any rail trips in particular that you would recommend?
Oh, this is a hard question, because basically I think almost any train ride in Switzerland is scenic, and I love traveling by train. But the best thing is that trains get to places that cars can't reach. So if you're looking for a normal train ride, not a designated tourist train, then I would say between Bern and Geneva is wonderful. When you come out of the tunnel after Fribourg, you have the whole of Lake Geneva on your left-hand side. Always sit on the left on that train when you're going towards Geneva. Otherwise, you just look at a stone wall. It's not very exciting.
That's a good tip.
But when it comes to the really touristy scenic train rides, I love the Bernina Express, the one in Graubünden. It's a UNESCO heritage line, and it curls round through the mountains, and it's actually the highest train line in Europe that doesn't use any rack railway or cog railway. So it's a normal train line that uses the incline to get up the slopes. Another one I do love, even though it is horribly overcrowded sometimes, obviously not this year. This year is a great time to go because there won't be any tour groups, is Jungfraujoch, the highest train station in Europe. It is expensive. Even if you have a half-price card or a GEA, it's still quite pricey, but I think it's really worth it. It was built over 100 years ago and goes up inside the Eiger, and you come out on top of the world, literally. And lastly, my last favorite one is the Gornergrat line up above Zermatt. It's actually very short. It's only 30 minutes, but it takes you up from Zermatt. It's the highest open-air railway in Europe. And you get the most amazing view at the top, not only the Matterhorn, but the highest peak in Switzerland, Dufourspitze, and you have this whole alpine panorama, and it's just breathtaking.
And would just an ordinary travel pass be valid on these routes?
Generally, yes. So if you have a GEA or a Tageskarte, a day card, or even if you have visitors from abroad and they have a Swiss pass, then yes. You will probably on some specific tourist trains like the Glacier Express, you will have to pay a surcharge for a compulsory seat reservation. And then, as I said, in Jungfrau Joch, it's expensive. The maximum discount is generally 50%, but they are valid.
All right, so here's something that you might like to take with you on one of those journeys, and that's chocolate. Is milk chocolate really a Swiss invention?
I'm so glad we mentioned chocolate. Yes, it is. It is the best Swiss gift to the world. That wasn't fondue, and it certainly wasn't the Kuchenglocke because that was German. It was milk chocolate, and it was a guy who was a candle maker called Daniel Peter. He lived in Vevey, and in 1875, he came up with this miraculous creation. He happened to be married to the daughter of a well-known chocolatier called Caillet, and Caillet is still a brand you can find in Switzerland. And he took his father-in-law's bitter chocolate drink, mixed it with condensed milk from his neighbor Henri Nestlé, and created the first ever solid milk chocolate. So no one had managed that before, and he managed to make it stable and edible, which is kind of crucial if you want someone to buy some chocolate. And the other man we have to thank is Rudolf Lindt, who was from Bern, and he created this process called conching, which basically ground the mass down until it was smooth and silky, because before that, chocolate was quite grainy, and we probably wouldn't like it as much as we do now if Rudolf Lindt hadn't been around.
Oh, now I can tell you've put some research into this. And in your considered opinion, which is the best brand?
Yeah, that's a leading question. I really honestly think, having tasted almost every single brand in Switzerland, there is no such thing as a bad brand of Swiss chocolate. I would even go as far as to say the own brands that Coop and Migros produce and sell taste just as good, and they're a quarter of the price. So you can pretty much rest assured that any chocolate you buy is great. Personally, I love Caillet. It's the oldest brand, and it's rarely exported. So you kind of feel like you're eating something that you can't find in New York or Milan or Melbourne.
All right. And I think that leads us nicely to our Swiss fact of the month.
And of course, we have to have one about chocolate. And this fact I love, and I found this out when I was researching my new book. The Swiss eat more chocolate every year than they do tomatoes or carrots. So it's 10 kilos per head of chocolate versus 9.5 kilos of tomatoes and only 8 kilos of carrots. I'm amazed that Swiss people aren't bigger than they are. But yes, we are the chocolate champions of the world.
And what are the recycling and rubbish rules? So once you finish with all of the chocolate wrappers, what should you do with them?
Well, sadly, I think very few chocolate wrappers are recyclable. So they end up in the rubbish. And the thing you have to remember about rubbish in Switzerland is that generally, in most places where you are, you pay for every bag you put out. And that means you either buy a specific bag, which is issued by the council, or you buy stickers from the council, which you put on normal rubbish bags. And so you could argue that the Swiss are being very eco-friendly because they have very high recycling rates. But you could also argue that it's just about money, because obviously the more you recycle, the less rubbish you have, so the less you pay for that rubbish to be picked up. Typically, everyone recycles quite a lot here, but it's up to you as the consumer. It's not like in Britain where you put out a box of mixed recycling, the council picks it up and you don't have to do anything, really. Here, the consumer basically does all the work. So you have to separate out everything, and you take back some things to the supermarkets, things like batteries and light bulbs, and especially the PET plastic bottles, so water bottles or milk bottles. And supermarkets will take all those back because they sell them. I quite like that idea because it puts the cost of it, collecting them, on the supermarkets, and they're the ones making money from selling it. So the cost of it isn't on the council, it's on the supermarket. Then there are things like metal and glass, and they generally have to go back to a recycling center. They can either be a big recycling center that's out of town, or in some cities, like in Bern, we have a little recycling mini center in every neighborhood, and they're giant underground bins, and you just pop the glass and the metal in. One thing to be aware of, do not do it on a Sunday because it's noisy and it's against the rules. So you can recycle any day except Sunday when you can't save the planet. You have to wait till Monday to save the planet. Lastly, paper and card. usually you tie those up and they're collected once or twice a week or once every 2 weeks from the doorstep for free.
And unlike other places, there's an incentive for people to recycle because they'll save money versus putting everything in the rubbish.
Yes, and it's not done by weight. The rubbish isn't done by weight, as I know it is in some countries, but here it's just done per sack. So you buy different size sacks. So I'll give you the example in Bern. You have a 35-litre sack, which is the normal size for a household rubbish bin, and that costs £1.50 per bag. So obviously it's not that expensive, but if you're putting everything in the rubbish, then it mounts up. So a lot of people sort out their organic waste, for instance, and have an organic bin, which is then collected by the council as well. So it reduces that sort of waste as well.
And what about bigger items like furniture?
Well, very often you'll walk down the street and you'll see a chair sitting on the pavement and it'll be written gratis or free. That's one way of getting rid of them. And generally, someone will pick it up if it's free. The other option is you take it to a charity shop. There aren't as many here as there are in other countries, but the main one is the Salvation Army, and they have big charity shops. The one in Bern and the one I've been to in Zurich, it's almost like a department store. It sells everything: furniture, clothes, crockery, records, books, everything. Or, of course, if it's not reusable, upcyclable, you can take it to one of those big recycling centers. But then you have to pay for it to be accepted. So it's not that expensive, but you do have to pay for it to be taken away.
And here's something which can cause some apprehension for people learning German. So when can you switch from the formal to the informal form of you?
Well, you never asked me, Daniel. I mean, we're on first name terms, so that would imply that we would be on the informal form of you. And it is quite hard for English speakers because we got rid of the thee and thou and ye and you and everything many years ago. We just have you, whether you're talking to your boss or whether you're talking to a child. But all four of these Swiss national languages have this multiple forms of you. It's informal, formal, plural, singular, and it's very confusing, especially when you're learning it. Generally, I would say stick to the formal when you don't know someone, so a stranger you've just met, or if you happen to talk to someone on the bus. Definitely always anyone older than you or higher up the food chain, so someone in a higher position in your company, or if you're meeting someone who's relatively important, if you move in those circles, always use the formal form to be sure. Informal, and to be clear, we're talking Sie and vous in German and French for formal, and du and tu for informal. And informal is for family, friends, generally people younger than you, so children, and you can switch between the two, but it's usually by mutual consent. So with neighbors, for instance, or you can say, oh, let's move to do, and if that person is a higher status than you, so your boss, you typically have to wait for him or her to say, let's switch to do. It would be quite rude for you to do it or to suggest it. Now, of course, when I was learning German, it was very easy to be formal because it's the infinitive of the verb plus e. So I was formal with everyone, whether they were family or friends or not. And then I learnt the informal form, which especially with irregular verbs is harder. And so then I was informal with everyone and offended lots of people by being this ignorant foreigner who didn't know how to be polite. So it is a minefield, but it's generally a minefield that people are willing to accept that you don't know what you're doing.
And what are the Swiss national languages?
Well, I've mentioned two already. There's German, which is by far the majority. It's about 65%. But then there's also French, Italian, and the unique Swiss language, Romansh, which is only spoken in the canton of Graubünden and has about 60,000 native speakers, so it's quite small. That's a very broad brush. Obviously, within the German, for instance, there are many dialects. Collectively, they're also known as Swiss German, but then when you stay here a little bit, you can slightly hear the difference and learn the difference between Zürichdeutsch and Berndeutsch. They're all still German, and to an outsider, they all sound the same. But of course, when you live here, and especially when you learn to speak them, they are very different. But even French here is a little bit different from French in France. So the awful French numbers like 98, and you're thinking 4, 20, 10, 8, what number is that? Is much, much easier here. So 88 becomes huit on huit. And it's less complicated for your mental maths.
Is Switzerland in the EU?
Well, I'm hoping you know the answer to that one, Daniel. The short answer is no, of course it isn't. But it is complicated, like everything in Switzerland. And that's really because it's not officially a member, and it's certainly not a formal member. And I often say it's like a hokey-cokey member, one leg in, one leg out. And it goes back to 1992 when the voters decided in a hugely important referendum, the highest turnout ever in Swiss history, not to join the European Economic Area as a first step to joining the EU. And it was rejected by a very, very small majority. It made Brexit look like a landslide. It was that close. And since then, it's been off the cards. And instead, the last 29 years, Switzerland has negotiated a series of bilateral treaties with the EU, covering almost every aspect of life and work here. So free movement of people, but also trade, aviations, pensions, electricity, everything. And each one of those has been approved by a popular vote. So that means that I moved here as a British citizen, and at the time I was also an EU citizen, though no longer. I could live here easily. And most of the immigrants who live here are EU citizens. It's about 70% of the foreigners living here are EU citizens because they're entitled to. And Swiss can live in the EU. So it is part of the free movement of people, but you still need to apply for a visa. You still need to apply for residency. It's not automatic, but it is accepted as long as you can prove that in the first year or so you're not going to be a burden on the state and you have either a job or your own means or whatever. So it's kind of this halfway house. Switzerland does contribute to the EU budget as well, but not a huge amount. And it's kind of in the middle, not in, not out.
And you mentioned there that you arrived as a EU citizen, although you're not anymore. And how about life in Switzerland for Brits after Brexit? Has anything changed?
Well, do we actually know what Brexit means at the moment? The good thing is, because Switzerland isn't in the EU, when those torturous negotiations were going on for 4 years, Switzerland was not involved because it wasn't an EU member. So it could negotiate separate agreements with Britain. And it did that. And even before Brexit was signed, sealed and delivered, Switzerland and Britain had come up with new agreements to cover aspects of life that already were covered by Britain being an EU member. So, for instance, the right to live and work and study here. But there is a big difference between Brits who were already here when Brexit happened, like you and me, and new arrivals. That's something we are going to look at in greater depth. And we decided, I think, rather sensibly to wait a few months to see how things are settling down, because Brexit is a bit of a mess at the moment, even if the government in Britain doesn't like to admit it. But generally, if you were here before Brexit happened, you roughly have the same rights as you did being an EU citizen. If you are now arriving, then you are a third nation national, so you're equivalent to an American or a Serbian. And so there are quotas for immigration and different rules for immigration and living here. So that's broadly the difference, but we're going to look at it later.
Right, we'll be looking at this in more detail in another episode. But if you are a Brit and you'd like to work here, you are still eligible for a permit, but there will be quotas.
Yes, and it depends on obviously what sector you're in and which canton you want to live in, whether you speak the languages, whether you have, etc., etc. So quotas exactly the same as any other immigrant from outside the EU. The only good thing is that at the moment, at least for the first year, as far as I understand it, the Swiss government has said the quotas for Britain will roughly mirror how many immigrants used to come in the last few years under the EU rules. So they're not going to reduce the quotas for Brits at the moment. It's just the quotas are there and they weren't there before.
All right, now changing topic slightly to something which can be quite controversial. Did Wilhelm Tell actually exist?
Now, you probably think he did. And if you did, you wouldn't be alone, because 64% of Swiss people believe he existed. And he is their national hero, so we do have to be careful what we say. But I'm going to disappoint the 64% and you and say no, he didn't exist.
I knew that.
He is much more myth than man. He's a bit like Robin Hood, only a bit burlier. I mean, Robin Hood, I always think of Errol Flynn or even Kevin Costner, but Wilhelm Tell is a bit more like Hagrid. And he is a Swiss hero, but he's generally a Swiss hero because of two foreigners, a play written by a German and an opera written by an Italian. And that's what made him famous in the 19th century. But you can sort of find where he was supposed to have been. If you go to Altdorf, which is the capital of Canton Uri, there is a statue in the main square, and that's where the famous apple shooting scene took place. We'll pretend it really took place and just say, yes, the statue is real, so therefore the scene is real. And that's where he had to shoot the apple off the head of his poor son standing there. And you can also, just near Altdorf is Lake Lucerne, and that is where Rütli is, the meadow where Switzerland was born. Now, if you've seen the Tell play, he is involved in the birth of Switzerland, and of course he wasn't. But so if you go to Rütli, he doesn't get a mention. But just across the lake is the Tell Chapel, where he escaped from the baddies, from the Austrians, when a storm came across Lake Lucerne. And so you can see where he landed and ran away to freedom. So there are various places you can find Tell, other than on a beer in Co-op. He does get everywhere. But you can go and see him in central Switzerland.
Was there ever any mention of a Mrs. Tell?
Well, she never gets a mention. She doesn't appear in the story really at all. But I am presuming there was, because there is a Master Tell. There is that poor boy with the apple on his head, whose name was Walter. So unless Wilhelm Tell had a surrogate mother for his child, which I guess in the 13th century wasn't a theme, yes, there was a Mrs. Tell, but we don't know her name, and she doesn't really get a mention, which is kind of what happened to Swiss women for much of Swiss history, really.
Yes, and speaking of women in Switzerland, when did they get the vote?
Well, that is an excellent question, and we'll answer that next time, because next time we are going to look at the political system in Switzerland, and especially direct democracy, because it is unique to this country. So hopefully you know the answer to that, and I don't have to mansplain it to you. But if you don't know the answer, you can listen in next month, and we'll start with the answer to that question.
Yes, we'll be going into more detail about that the next time. So it's goodbye for now from me.
And from me, Diccon Bewes, a best-selling author of a book called Swiss Watching, amongst many other books.
And thanks to you for listening. We'll include links in the show notes to our guest and to further materials about some of the topics that we've spoken about today. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Once again, this podcast was brought to you by Rigby. We're a staffing and project services company here in Zurich. If you would like our help either to hire or to be hired, let us know. Best way to do that is by going to rigby.ch/apply and filling out the form. You can also sign up for our newsletter at rigby.ch/newsletter to receive our Living in Switzerland guide. We'll send you one email per month about expat-focused news and jobs in Switzerland. So thanks, and until the next time.